Roommates, to me, were necessary annoyances that helped pay half the rent. I had grown up with much older siblings who left home when I was 7, and then I grew up mostly as an only child after that. I had a certain perspective that was, well, mine. I was the roommate who set the vacuum cleaner out in the middle of the floor to let the other person know it was their turn to clean. If only everyone could live by my rules, the world would be a better place. Yep, I was that roommate. That vacuum sat out for 3 days until rushing to class one day, I tripped on it and broke my toe. After the dorms, my first college roommate was Mary, a psychology student attending university on a full-paid scholarship, which I took to mean she studied all the time and would make a good roommate who stayed in her room and didn't bother me. Mary had grown up on a farm in Kansas. She sold her 4-H blue ribbon cow to buy a Camaro to drive to the University of Oklahoma, where we met. A farm girl from Kansas with a pet cow. Responsible, morals, Midwestern work ethics. She had it all for the perfect roommate. We lived together for our sophomore and junior years of college. The first issue was when she put my iron skillet in the dishwasher. You'd think a farm girl would know better. Have you ever wanted to see the full effects of oxidation? But Mary and I grew a little restless in our junior year. I'd broken up with my loser boyfriend who thought he wanted to be a detective and solve mysteries with a gun. And she had broken up with her engineering student boyfriend who never left his room or books. I thought Mary should learn to live a little. So I took her to parties with me and water skiing on the weekends with some guy I knew who had a boat and a fancy car. Under my guidance, she learned to be a party girl. And we laughed a lot. Then Mary got a new boyfriend, Michael, who she said she knew from her past. Mary's new boyfriend bought her lots of fancy gifts, like pearl necklaces, which were all the rage in the 80s. When she locked herself out one night and I woke up at 4 a.m. to banging on the front door, only to find her standing there in a full-length fox fur coat, I began to wonder. When I came home from class another afternoon and the boyfriend sat at the kitchen table counting stacks of greenbacks that he was stashing in Crown Royal bags, I became concerned. When a brand new IROC Z convertible took the place of the 4-H Cal Camaro, concern turned into worry. Ruining an iron skillet was annoying enough, but drug dealing was not in any of the roommate rule books that I figured were known by all but followed by few of you. One day, Mary said she was going to meet her guy in Miami for a pickup, and she'd be gone a few days. While she was gone, her mom called and told me she'd read a notice in the local Kansas newspaper that Mary had married Michael from their hometown in Kansas. He was an ex-con, and Mom was very scared. I became scared, too. When Mary returned a few days later and her IROC was not in the driveway, I found her sitting in her dark room, scared shitless. I asked her what happened. Her brother had brought her home. She was fine, other than shock, but it was a miracle. She had been doing lines of coke in her car, driving overnight to Florida from Oklahoma, when she saw an 18-wheeler changing lanes in front of her, but she thought she could make it around him in time. Her IROC went under the middle of the trailer, between the wheels, slicing off the top of her new car. I could have been decapitated, she said. I told her she might want to get away from Michael. But it wasn't his fault, she said. She was foolish, I thought. The type of person who has to be told when to vacuum, how to clean an iron skillet, and when to quit partying so hard. After an unpaid $400 phone bill, and then I found out she'd been taking my rent check to the landlord but not paying her half, I realized she wasn't one of those convenient annoyances that paid the rent. So I took my vacuum and I moved out. In my opinion, she was ruining her life, and I wanted respectable roommates, people who lived their life the way I thought it should be lived. Michael eventually went back to prison for drug dealing, and Mary lost her scholarship. I ran into her a couple of years later, and she said she finally made it to graduate school. She still had her head, but she still looked scared shitless. That was the 80s. In 1993, my vacuum and I moved into what we roommates deemed the healing house. We'd all come from broken relationships, and we shared a house not unlike the Brady Bunch house, and we were like Marcia, Jan, and Cindy, only we were Sarah, Carol, and Amy. We all had long, straight blonde hair and thought of ourselves as independent women who sat on the sofa every night and watched Nick at Night. Mostly Mary Tyler Moore and frozen microwave burritos. Sarah had just broken up with her boyfriend because all he did was smoke pot all day. My boyfriend had broken up with me, so I decided to become celibate. I'd read in a magazine that if you could be celibate for a year, you'd learn to love yourself. Still working on that one. And Carol had just come out of a long-term relationship with a real estate developer who had a big house and lots of money. They were going to get married, and then bam, a week before the wedding, he dumped her. All those ordered napkins and liquor were not going to go to waste, so on her intended wedding day, Sarah and I threw her a party. We invited all the women we knew, and we filled that 2-story house with raging drunk women and celebrated Carol's new single life. Sarah and I even made her a papier-mâché penis piñata. Celibate me worked on the head of the penis and decided it should be circumcised. Sarah covered 2 standard balloons with wet newspaper and took a blow dryer to the testicles. We painted it a flesh tone, and the piñata was complete with black yarn pubic hair. We strung it up by an electrical cord just to show how much power we had over the penis. And since it was the days of Thelma and Louise, we filled it not with candy, but with tiny little liquor bottles. Our party rocked. Our party rocked fucking hard. And for one day, her wedding day, Carol forgot she'd been dumped by a loser. And I won't tell you how frightened the pizza boy was when he came to our house that night. Not long after, Carol met someone else. She came home to tell us that she'd been asked out on a date by someone we might be a little surprised to meet. Why, we asked. He's covered in tattoos, she said. Back then, to have a full body tattoo meant you were, in the words of my grandmother, a dirty person. It wasn't like it is today where it's as common as piercing your ears. In the 90s, there weren't those cool tattoo parlors on every corner. Hank was his name. He's nicer to me than anyone I've ever met, Carol said. Our hearts soared for her. A nice man, someone who's kind, generous, and thoughtful. We loved that. We all wanted that. Body tattoos be damned. He sent her flowers, gave her hand-drawn cards, and took her on picnics on his lunch break from Postal Plus where he worked. I never said anything, but as you might imagine, I silently judged her and knew this would come to no good. Then she came home one day unhappy. He had broken his parole. He'd smoked a little pot, he said, and then they had a surprise drug test and he had to go to prison and finish up his sentence. Go back to prison? We didn't know he'd been in prison. Obviously, my instincts were right. He was just in for making fake IDs, fraud. He still has 2 years to serve, Carol explained. 2 years? That's like a lifetime in the dating world. He could get out early for good behavior again, she said. In the back of my mind, I wondered how long this relationship would last. I was disappointed. Carol vacuumed and cleaned up after herself. I still wanted roommates who followed rules and kept to themselves, who lived respectable lives, people who did things the right way, my way, and Carol was not going in that direction. We sat on the couch each night, waiting with Carol for the collect calls to come in from the Lompoc prison. I kept my thoughts to myself, and we wished her well when she went for visits every other weekend. He still sent flowers, which how he ordered them from prison could not be revealed, and he sent her homemade cards elaborately drawn in blue Bic pen. The same pen used for tattooing, because in prison that's how they tattooed. We learned a lot of new things about prison. Hank was a great tattoo artist and made a little money on the side in the Slammer as the resident tattoo artist. He was considered one of the best until he got caught Apparently, it's illegal to have the means to tattoo in prison. That is, a sharp, pointy object to cut the skin deeply in a ballpoint pen. Hank did get out earlier than expected. When I woke up one morning and made my way downstairs to get coffee, I was startled to find the exquisitely tattooed ZZ Top band member lookalike sitting at the table in the near-dark kitchen. Carol explained that he'd been released in her custody. He'd be staying with us. Hope that's okay. I made a mental note that I'd have to quit wearing baby doll pajamas and stick to sweatpants. Even though he seemed like a nice guy, I doubted he vacuumed. Because we were women who supported one another, Sarah and I said it would be okay. Again, I kept it to myself, but I knew that this was asking for trouble. How could an ex-con ever be appropriate for a roommate? It wasn't permanent, Carol said, just until Hank got back on his feet and the parole board would allow him to live on his own. We didn't ask how long that would be. We just learned some new parts of a parolee's life, like when a call came in each evening from prison, we were to say he was asleep when really he and Carol were out. In my head, I'm thinking, not following the rules, bad roommates. Eventually, I left the healing house to get married, and Sarah moved to San Francisco for a new job. The healing house broke up, and we went our separate ways. I don't remember who got the vacuum. Carol and I got together for a drink a few years later. She and Hank had an apartment of their own, and he was still doing his artwork. Couldn't find a job that paid much, and she supported them, but she reported she was happy. I was broke and had an inkling that my husband was cheating on me after 2 years, but wasn't about to tell anyone about my misfortune in case they were to judge me. But I did accidentally spill a glass of wine all over the front of Carol's new mint green suit. I couldn't even afford to offer to pay for a new suit, so I offered to have it dry cleaned, which we both knew would be fruitless. I never saw or heard from her again after that. Thinking back, it's like watching a rerun of the sitcom of the best years of my youth. I see women supporting one another in all the right and wrong ways. I was a stickler for perfectionism and never told them what I truly thought of their choices in men, but mine were no better. I considered myself the perfect roommate, one who cleaned the counters and made no noise and always paid her rent on time. Although, when there are wine spills, I think of Carol, and I know that not all stains come out, so I shouldn't judge quite so quickly, and probably be a lot more forgiving. I also still have the iron skillet that went through the heavy load cycle on the dishwasher, and I think of Mary every time I use it, because skillets can be re-seasoned and come back to life. Friends are the oxygen of life, but all our foibles and mishaps and bad decisions are the seasoning. And when I think of that vacuum in the middle of the floor and my broken toe, I'm pretty sure being passive-aggressive has never really worked for me.
That was Amy Wallen.